the Sports Lawyers Association's podcast, Sports Shorts. And today I'm very happy to have as my guest philosopher and professor emeritus at USC, William Morgan. Bill, welcome to our program.
Glad to be here, Bobby.
So we usually start off, and I'd like to today in our typical fashion, is to talk a little bit about what you're doing these days and what is the philosophy of sport, if that's a fair enough question to get things started.
Sure. Well, we can start with that last question first. So philosophy of sport is, the way to think of it is essentially applying the tools of philosophy to an important area of culture. So, lots of people have taken courses in philosophy of education, philosophy of science, philosophy of art, philosophy of religion. And so philosophy of sport would sort of fit that sort of pattern. It's not inherently a philosophical area, but it's certainly one that you can apply philosophic tools to. And so I've been teaching philosophy of sport for almost 4 decades until I retired a few years ago. And the various things that I've been working on, can I plug a book I wrote? Is that okay?
Of course.
Okay, so I published a book in 2020 with Temple University Press called Sport and Moral Conflict, a Conventionalist Theory. And what I was interested in that book was there's no living without standards of living, and among the most important standards are ethical standards. And so I was interested in various ethical theories that can be applied to sports. And there were 2 primarily. One was called formalism, which is basically a very simple argument that if you want to understand how you should ethically comport yourself in sports, then you follow the spirit and law of the rules. There are problems with that, which we can talk about in due course. But the other theory is called broad internalism. And it's basically the argument that because rules are often ambiguous, because rules are rarely exhaustive, there's always novel situations coming up and the like, that you simply can't rely on the rules. So what you have to do from a broad internalist perspective is you have to operate with basic ethical principles. And this was patterned after the work of Ronald Dworkin, a philosopher of law from NYU. And the basic idea is when a hard case arises where the rules don't make it clear what one should do, then you need to think about, well, what is it that we're trying to test in this athletic realm? And what are the aims? What are people trying to do? And they think it's pretty clear that competitive sports are all about athletic excellence. So when you run into a dilemma, what you should think about is how would someone who understands sport to be a forum for the pursuit of excellence answer that question? And again, we can get in the thicket of some of those issues a little bit if you want to. And then the last thing is I actually didn't think either of those theories worked very well. So I try to develop what's called a conventionalist theory of sport. And it's basically the argument that the broad internalists were right. The best way to look at ethical questions is to try to figure out what it is that the sport realm is all about. What are you trying to do? But then the problem with broad internalism is that it came up with an abstract answer, the pursuit of excellence. Well, the problem is that at different historical periods and different places, people had quite different ideas of what constitutes athletic excellence and what sorts of skills are actually central to sport. So for me, most of the heavy ethical lifting has to do with what are the social conventions at the time? How are people thinking about sports and what sorts of skills, what sorts of substances you might be able to take, what sorts of technical aids might be appropriate? And again, at different historical periods, people have given quite different answers to that question. A second area that I was interested in had to do with aesthetics and whether or not aesthetic judgments influence our aesthetic judgments and vice versa. So imagine you're going to an art gallery and with a friend, and you see this painting that it blows you away. The colors and the images are something that you've never seen before. Um, and you're quite excited about it, and you think it's absolutely beautiful. And then you run into your friend later on and you tell them about this painting, and your friend says, well, you should know how the artist produced that painting. And he said, what do you mean? He said, well, evidently, he would take goldfish and dip them in different colors and spread them on the canvas and produce this, what you think is a beautiful painting. But what actually was going on is each of these goldfish were asphyxiating right before your eyes. And now the question is, okay, now that you know how this painting was made, and it obviously was ethically problematic, now I'm going to ask you again, do you think that's a beautiful painting? And some people think these are two separate judgments, and some might say, yeah, it's a beautiful painting, but it was ethically untoward the way it was made. Other people think, actually, you're going to change your aesthetic judgment. In the realm of sports, there's the famous hand of God Maradona in a soccer game most people are familiar with. They were playing the English side, and at a crucial point in the match, it looked like Maradona had a beautiful header into the net to score the goal. And assume you're in the stands and you see it and you think, wow, what a beautiful move on Maradona's part. And then you go home, and the next day the papers come out and they show a clear photograph that makes it very, very clear he punched the ball in with his hand. Now ask yourself, do you still think that was a beautiful goal? And I think actually ethical judgments do affect aesthetic judgments. And then the last thing, the stuff I'm working on now, and I'll wrap this up quickly, is I'm interested in why it is that people, sports spectators, dedicated sports fans, act as if their very life is on the line during a game, when the outcome of the game will have absolutely no appreciable bearing on the rest of their lives. And so a group of philosophers, I call them fictionalists, argued that going to a sports match or watching on television is very much like going to a play or a movie. And essentially, people who go to movies and plays get utterly emotionally absorbed in the play or the movie. But yet, nothing's real. These are fictional films, fictional people, made up stories. And so fictionalists argue roughly, it's a little more complicated than this, but they roughly argue that people simply pretend that these people are real and these events are real. And then when the movie is over, they usually go with their friends and have a cappuccino or whatever, and as if nothing had happened. And in a sports match, they start to look at sports. Kendall Walton was probably the most famous proponent of this at University of Michigan, and he argued that sports fans do much the same. Now they know full well that the players are real, the action on the field is real, but winning, again, which will not affect very many people, unless you're betting on the games or it has some other direct impact on you, has no bearing on your life. So why is it you get so excited about it? And it's, well, you pretend that winning really is important. And so that's the project that I'm working on now. I think fictionalists are totally wrong. But anyway, so that's sort of been the scope of my work for the last 6 or 7 years. Excuse me, 6 or 7 years.
Well, this is all really interesting because oftentimes we talk about, I think from a 30,000-foot view, about ethical behavior in sports.
Yeah.
Traditionally is following the rules.
Yeah.
If you break the rules, you're out of the game. But what happens? How would you view the situation of the period in American baseball where a vast majority, I believe, or let's say a large percentage of players were using substances, steroids,
Yes.
whatnot, and there are some that say, well, it was fine because baseball was not doing very well. it was in decline, and all of a sudden, all these homers, fans got involved, brought baseball back. Where does that lie on the spectrum of philosophical thought?
Well, the idea that you have to make sports commercially appealing is problematic because that often means that you're preaching to the lowest common denominator. I remember when I was doing my grad work at University of Minnesota, I like to joke with friends. I went from being a Roman Catholic to a Minnesota Vikings fan, and they weren't doing so well up until this year that I actually thought about converting back to Catholicism. But at any rate, a lot of I mean, being at those live events, a lot of people were inebriated. They had no understanding of the game to speak of, and the like. And the more you broaden that audience, the less people know about it. So when you're trying to sell the game that way, I think you run into all sorts of problems. Now, performance enhancing drugs are an interesting issue precisely because if I understand the present social conventions of baseball and football and the like, unlike, for example, at the turn of the century, there was a sort of gentleman amateur conception of sport, which basically argued you should try to win, but you shouldn't try to win too hard because anything you do that's overboard and the like will detract from the pleasure of the competition. Well, that's not our take on sports anymore. Our take on sports right now is, athletic superiority and the like. And in a weird way, people seem to draw an arbitrary line with, things like sleeping in oxygen deprivation chambers, using certain kinds of special suits in swimming to increase their speed and the like. And these all sort of chime with our present view of sports as trying to be the best athlete you possibly can. And it included all sorts of nutritional substances, use of creatine and the like. And then people started to say, well, we've got a problem with steroids. Unfortunately, no one ever came up with any good arguments against them. And so people said, well, look, if you use steroids, you're putting your health in danger. Well, guess what? If you participate in elite sports, you're doing the same. Bertolt Brecht, the great German playwright, once wrote that great sport begins where good health ends. Most athletes train at such a level that it's actually not good for their overall health. Some people said there was a fairness problem. Well, there is a fairness problem, but the rule creates the fairness problem. Get rid of the rule and against performance-enhancing drugs, and there won't be a fairness issue. None of the arguments really held up all that well. And so I'm dubious about a lot of the arguments. The other problem with the testing performance-enhancing drugs is that they were testing for recreational drugs as well. And I'm not sure that public sport authorities have the right to monitor athletes' private behavior in that sense. So I'm sort of on the edge when it comes to performance enhancing drugs. If people want to compete without the use of performance enhancing drugs, that's possible, except I know, for example, in powerlifting, which may not really be a sport, but they have competitions for drug-free participants, and what happens is that some of these people will come in and use the drug so they can win. So, do I promote performance-enhancing drugs? No, but I have a hard time understanding why a male can go to his doctor in his 50s or whatever and says, I don't have the same level of virility I used to have. And he will be given a prescription for testosterone. I'm not sure why an athlete who might want to boost their athletic prowess with testosterone shouldn't also be allowed to use it. So the problem is there's just not any really good arguments that really work in the case of performance-enhancing drugs.
Well, this sort of begs another issue. which we've seen more and more lately. And it's sort of in the general world of transgender athlete
Mm.
participation, but it also looks to um, the case of certain athletes that have female athletes that have a high level of testosterone,
Yes.
naturally occurring high level of
Yes.
testosterone. But sporting authorities have said, oh, it's not fair.
Right.
But if that's your natural condition, how can you ethically say that's not playing by the rules because of how you're biologically set up? It seems like
Yeah.
a very troubling situation there.
Yeah, it does. I would caution, though, that because something is natural doesn't mean it passes any kind of ethical test. So, for example, on my father's side, coronary artery disease is very much prominent. I wish it wasn't, but it doesn't give me any advantage. In fact, it gives me a disadvantage. The transgender athlete thing is right now an extremely hot topic. The best piece that I've read on the subject was by John Pike, Open University, and he published a really interesting piece. And you have to consider the sports as well. So I know you were a rugby fan or a player or whatever. In women's rugby, it can be quite dangerous for people who use certain performance enhancing drugs in terms of their capacity to hurt someone else. So that's always a sort of consideration. What he concluded was that there does seem to be an advantage that transgender athletes have, and we're talking now about men transitioning into women and playing women athletes. And but the problem is they can't pinpoint what that advantage can is in terms of particular variables. So, for example, puberty seems to be a big part of it, but as you point out, testosterone levels are all over the place. And some women have naturally high testosterone levels, and some men have naturally low testosterone levels. So when they've tried to pinpoint it to a particular level of testosterone or some other physiological variable, it almost always turns out that you can't neatly pin the advantage to that one particular variable. So it's a very messy area right now, and I don't see any clear ethical path there other than the observation that women athletes have a point. I'm talking about cisgender women athletes now, not transitioned women athletes. They do have a point that that their transgender um, competitors do seem to have some sort of advantage in competitions in women's sports.
Well, that seems to be the biggest concern, but I'm also wondering where the balance you've talked about, one theory is, playing by the rules is what matters, and another you have to sort of take a more contextual approach of what's going on within the
Right.
sporting universe. But does the concept of fairness get into this at all? I mean,
Yes.
on the one hand, is it fair that uh, I'm a 5'8" person and I'm competing against a 6'8" person? That's different. I don't think that's a question of fairness in competing in
No.
sports,
No.
but there is an element of fairness where somebody, I mean, if somebody's just has better athletic skills and naturally more athletic, is that fair? Sure, nobody's changed any rules, but at what point does fairness slip away and you're no longer playing by the rules?
Yeah. I mentioned before formalism, and the basic idea of formalism is that look, if you comply with the rules, then you've played fairly. Now the problem is, and as someone in law, you would know this, is that the rules are never exhaustive. So, for example, there was at the turn of the 20th century, there was a baseball game between Louisville and I can't remember the other team, and Louisville had loaded the bases, and the batter had hit a double or whatever. And the first runner for Louisville who crossed home plate, wrestled the catcher to the ground, and pinned him to the ground so his other two mates on base could score. Okay. Now, the rule at that time was no base runner may interfere with a player. Well, once the guy who was wrestling the catcher to the ground had hit home plate, he was no longer a base runner. Okay, so did he do anything unfair? Well, from a formula standpoint, they would have to say no, but that's completely counterintuitive. So here's where the broad internalist comes in and says, look, it's not fair because what are we trying to do in baseball? What's the relevant skill here? And if you think about what the point of baseball is, and you think about athletic excellence as it applies to baseball, obviously your ability to wrestle the catcher to the ground has nothing to do with baseball. So the broad internalist says that in fact that player should be declared out and the other two runners disallowed and go back on base. So you got a hole in the rules, right? So that's why the rules are problematic. Even now, of course, as the game goes on, they try to close those loopholes and but there's always going to be a novel situation. I didn't see this game, but when Oregon played Ohio State, they won the game by 1 point, and Ohio State had the ball. They were still too far out for a field goal. There was 20-some seconds left. And what the coach of the Oregon team did is deliberately, he put 12 players on the field. Buddy Ryan for the Eagles used to do this all the time, except he would sometimes put 14 players on the field. But at any rate, he put 12 players on the field. That gave them an extra defender. Ohio State tried a pass that went incomplete. Then a penalty was called because they had 12 men on the field. Okay, well, here's the problem. 4 or 5 seconds elapsed on the clock. So now Ohio State is down to, I think, 22 or 24 seconds, something around there. Yes, they got the 5-yard penalty, but Oregon also got an advantage. Now, there was no rule at the time that covered that. So what did the NCAA do? They adopted the principle no one should ever gain an advantage from engaging in a penalty, from committing a penalty. Therefore, they closed the loophole and said that if this happens in the future, the Ohio State would have been given the 5 yards. I believe they would have given them the 5 yards, and then they would start the clock at the original time the play commenced. So that's the problem with the rules. There's always going to be those instances where, there's not an applicable rule here that really deals with the situation. Another great example was George Brett. He was a third baseman for the Kansas City Royals. They were playing the New York Yankees. It was the top of the ninth. New York was the home team. And Brett was up to bat, and he hit a 2-run homer that put them in the lead. And when he crossed home plate, Billy Martin, the famous New York Yankee manager, walked to the umpires and they took Brett's bat, and they had a long discussion with the umpires. And after that discussion, the umpire at home called Brett out. Well, here's what happened. Martin, earlier in the season, had noticed that pine tar, which you put on the bottom of the bat for grip, and it can only be, the rule is 16 inches or whatever the case might be. And Martin immediately realized, his pine tar exceeds the limit of the rule. But I'm going to wait and not call attention to the umpires until a situation arises where I can use this in a meaningful way. So that's what he did. Now, here's a case where you could argue that following the rule actually got in the way of what baseball's all about. So, for example, he hit a home run. Now, what advantage did the pine tar give him? Maybe a little bit more grip strength. Maybe he could have, the speed of the bat would have been important. But if it hit lower on the bat, it actually would have retarded the ball. So a broad internalist would say, hey, let's look at what, where does a home run count in the repertoire of skills in baseball? And did this pine tar in any way aid his home run? And they would argue that, in fact, though technically it was an illegal bat, that you should override the rule and give him the home run. And that's exactly what happened a day or two afterwards when the president of the American League weighed in and said he's going to be grant him the homer, replay the game at the point after Brett hit the home run. So again, that's where the sort of the rules leave us in a lurch, and so we can't. The rules just aren't going to do it for us. So appealing to the rules and expecting fairness to be the end result just doesn't work. So obviously, we need some other sort of either broad internalist principle or convention about what are this. Well, how do we currently think about how sports should be done? And if I can give one more example,
Yeah, please.
so with the broad internalist, I said before that they always say, look at what this game is all about, and then ethically choose the action that best fits what the game's about and fits the profile of athletic excellence. Well, at the turn of the 20th century, in the 1904 Olympics, England and the United States were the major athletic powers. Not the only ones, but they're the major ones. The Olympics, of course, were a much smaller scale in those days, mainly track and field. And the English had a very very much their own conception of what counts as excellent sport. And for them, it was the gentleman amateur. I mentioned this a little bit before. You try to win, but you don't try so hard that it makes it unpleasurable for everyone involved. You call your own penalties, rule violations. You're skeptical of any kind of strategy. And so, for example, if in a cycling race, trying to box, as a team, if you're trying to box in your opponent so your lead cyclist can win, they would view that as immoral. If you're in a crew race and your opponent runs their craft into the ground, you wait for them to get back and settle and go on with the competition and the like. So they had their notion of athletic excellence. However, the American team, they thought the English were too lackadaisical about sport. For them, it's an all-out attempt to win and the like. So their conception of athletic excellence is you never consider the pleasure involved. Imagine a quarterback in the NFL at the third quarter in a tight game. He goes to the bench and he says to the coach, I'm not having any fun. So the coach is going to say, well, what do you mean you're not having any fun? That's not why we're out here. So they were very much, you do everything you can in a wholehearted way to win. You don't give your opponent the benefit of the doubt and like. Now, what happens when they get together and compete? For the broad internalist, he says, well, if we run into a hard case, we just say, okay, what's this game all about? What's the point? What's the aim? And what skills fit into this idea of athletic excellence? Well, they'll give you two entirely different answers. And so that leaves you completely helpless in that case. So that's why I think conventions are actually going to do most of the ethical work in those kinds of cases. I don't know if that makes any sense or not, but
No, it makes sense, and it's a really interesting area because, as lawyers, we're bound by ethical guidelines, how
yeah.
you're supposed to practice law and whatnot. And those of us working in the sports industry are sort of, how do we behave as lawyers representing our clients? But there are questions of how do you represent behaviors that may not agree with what you think are right?
Mm-hmm.
And are there multiple ethical parallel models in which we have to survive and juggle in the universe? I think there are, and I think we have to look to different realities. So the ethical constraints that we have as lawyers are, statutory and it's set out, and this is what you do, and these are your aspirational goals, etc.
Right.
But those don't apply to everybody else. And the same rules, an athlete has to compete fairly as those rules are defined in that particular sport.
Mm-hmm.
Not like the general rules of fairness. I mean, they sort of are an umbrella over the concept of it, but everybody wants an advantage. And at what point is an advantage a violation of some behavioral standard? It's a question.
And that's what puzzled Dworkin. I think his main case. He's the one who argued you can't just depend on rules. You need to have principles. And I think it was the Riggs case. This is a case where a grandson, his grandfather made out a will and made his grandson the beneficiary, the only beneficiary. The grandfather was quite wealthy, and the grandson murdered the grandfather. Now, according to the will, is it a codicil? Is that what they call it? Maybe
That's an
that's the wrong
attachment
word.
to a will.
Okay. So, according to the will, he should be the sole beneficiary. And when the case was tried, there was no rule that I mean, obviously, the murder. He's going to have to serve a sentence for murder. But as far as the will was concerned, he's the legitimate beneficiary. Well, the judge said no. He said no one in the law, and this is where Dworkin argued moral principles actually do play a role in law, in a very controversial position. And he said no one should benefit from committing an immoral act. And it's really interesting because I remember the Oregon Ohio State case. They invoked the same kind of principle that the judge did and that Dworkin advocates. And that was that, according to the NCAA rulemakers, no one should gain from a penalized action. So then they closed the loophole, and they were both appealing to not rules as such, but to certain principles, moral principles that we should abide by. The difference is a broad internalist would have said to Oregon, "No, this is unfair what you did, and we're going to put time back on the clock." But because they have to abide by rules in the NCAA and the like, they do it after the fact. But a broad internalist would have done it before the fact. So it's really interesting how all of this works out. And again, very much a controversial topic in law circles as well. And Max, I mean, I think I mentioned this to you when I first met you, is that some of the best philosophers doing work in sport were legal philosophers, precisely because they had to deal with these issues of adjudication.
Well, Bill, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to speak with us today. It was really interesting, and we've just sort of got to the tip of the iceberg, and
Sure.
might have to bring you back in for something else to talk with us some more, because this is a really fascinating subject that I think is good for all of us to consider as we represent people in the sports industry, not just athletes.
Yeah.
So thank you very much. And for those of you that are watching, we're at the end of the year. That means it's time to renew your membership in the Sports Lawyers Association. So please go to sportslaw.org and renew. And if you're not already a member, please join. In addition to all of the free content we put out there, there's a lot of great stuff behind our membership paywall. So thank you all. Hope you all had a great holiday season, and wishing you all the best in 2025. Bill, thank you so much. Really
Thank
appreciate it.
you.